Tonight, we aren't heading into a shield wall, nor are we embarking on a longship toward a distant, fog-covered horizon. Instead, we are stepping into a place that was often much more complicated and carefully regulated than any battlefield, the world of Viking romance. You see, before a young Norseman could dream of glory across the seas, he first had to navigate the intricate social landscape of his own village. He had to figure out if the girl on the neighboring farm actually liked him, or if her family was simply interested in his collection of iron tools and grazing sheep. In the Viking Age, finding a partner wasn't about expensive dinners or sudden sparks of destiny. It was a slow, deliberate game of land rights, legal contracts, and very specific rules about how people were allowed to interact within the walls of a smoky longhouse. It was a world where a misplaced gesture could lead to a heavy fine, and where a successful marriage was seen as the ultimate business merger. I'm Manuel, and welcome to my channel, Stillnight History. Before we dive deep into the misty fjords and the ancient laws of Scandinavia, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillows, find your favorite blanket, and let the quiet weight of the past settle over you. If you enjoy these long journeys into the world of historical sleep, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It really helps the algorithm find other restless historians who need a bit of peace at night. Now, dim your lights, turn down your volume, and let's ease into the quiet reality of Viking courtship. To understand how dating worked for a Viking, you first have to erase the image of the wild, lawless raider. The Norse people were, above all, a society of laws and farmers. Their lives revolved around the thing, the local assembly where laws were recited and disputes were settled. This legalistic mindset applied to everything, especially romance. Imagine you are a young man named Bjorn, living on a small farm in 9th century Norway. Your life is dictated by the seasons, the planting of barley, the shearing of sheep, and the long, dark winters where the sun barely skims the horizon. In this world, you don't just go out to meet people. Your social circle is your family, your neighbors, and the occasional traveler who stops by for a meal. When you reached a certain age, usually your late teens, the pressure to find a partner began. But this wasn't about finding a soulmate in the modern sense. A Viking marriage was a contract between two families, designed to ensure survival. If your family owned a good piece of coastal land but lacked enough livestock, and the family 3 miles away had a surplus of cattle but poor soil, a marriage between you and their daughter wasn't just a romantic idea, it was a strategic necessity. The process usually began with a formal visit. Your father, dressed in his best wool tunic, would travel to the other farm. He wouldn't go alone, he'd bring witnesses, men of standing who could verify the words spoken. They would sit in the longhouse, by the central fire, and the talk would start. They talked about the weather, the harvest, and the quality of the local iron. Only after hours of small talk would the real subject come up. The two fathers would discuss the munda, the bride price. This was the sum of money or goods that the groom's family paid to the bride's father. It wasn't buying a wife, it was a security deposit, a way to show that the groom had the resources to support a household. Then they discussed the heimanfylgja, the dowry. This was the property the bride brought with her into the marriage. If the numbers didn't match, the conversation ended there. No matter how much Bjorn liked the girl, if his father couldn't provide enough silver or sheep to satisfy her family's requirements, the match was dead. The dating phase, in many cases, happened only after the lawyers, or rather, the fathers, had already agreed on the price. Now, let's say the negotiation went well. The families are in agreement. Now you, Bjorn, actually get to spend time with your future wife. But don't think for a second that you are alone. In a Viking longhouse, privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. You lived in a single large room with your parents, your siblings, the farmhands, and sometimes even the livestock during a particularly cold winter. Flirting was a dangerous game. The Gragas, the ancient Icelandic law codes, are incredibly detailed about what was allowed and what wasn't. For example, if you were caught kissing a woman without the clear approval of her family, you could be fined. If you kissed her in public, the law considered it a serious offense. You could be declared an outlaw, which in the Viking world meant you lost all your legal rights. Anyone could technically attack you without consequence because you had broken the social peace. Even something as simple as holding hands could be scrutinized. The Norse were very protective of a woman's reputation, not necessarily out of modern romantic chivalry, but because her reputation was tied to the honor and the value of her family. To compromise a woman before the legal contracts were signed was a direct insult to her father and brothers, and in a society where blood feuds were a legitimate way to settle scores, a stolen kiss could lead to a decades-long conflict. So, how did you express your feelings in such a rigid system? You used the one tool the Vikings valued as much as a sword: poetry. The Norse were masters of the spoken word. They loved kennings, complex, metaphorical riddles. A young man wouldn't say, "You have beautiful blue eyes." He would compose a verse about the sapphires of the face that reflect the deep fjord. He would talk about the gold of the hair that shames the harvest grain. It was a slow, intellectual way of flirting. If the woman understood the metaphor and replied with a clever verse of her own, that was the Viking equivalent of a successful first date. It showed intelligence, wit, and a shared cultural understanding. However, even poetry had its laws. There was a specific type of poem called a mansonger, a love poem. Interestingly, writing love poems was technically illegal in some parts of the Viking world. Why? Because a love poem was seen as a form of sorcery or emotional manipulation. If a man wrote a poem that was too passionate, it was believed he was trying to steal the woman's will or damage her reputation. It's a strange thought, a society of fierce warriors who were terrified of a well-written poem. But it shows how much they respected the power of words. Every conversation was a delicate balance of staying within the law while trying to signal that, beneath the wool tunics and the heavy layers of social expectation, there was a genuine connection forming by the heat of the central hearth. Now that we've established the legal and social boundaries of the Longhouse, we have to look at the people themselves. There is a common misconception that Vikings were dirty, unkempt warriors with mud in their hair and blood on their tunics. In reality, when it came to dating and attraction, the Vikings were some of the most fastidious people in all of Europe. In fact, if you were a young man looking to impress a woman, your best weapon wasn't your axe, it was your comb. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia have revealed something fascinating. Among the swords and shields, the most common items found in Viking graves are grooming tools. We find beautifully carved bone combs, ear spoons for cleaning wax, tweezers, and even small razors. The Vikings took their appearance very seriously. For a Norseman, looking sharp was a sign of respect for oneself and for the community. In many historical chronicles from England, the local men actually complained that the Viking raiders were stealing all the local women. But it wasn't through force, it was through hygiene. The English monks wrote with a hint of annoyance that the Vikings bathed every Saturday, combed their hair every day, and changed their clothes frequently. In a time when much of Europe considered bathing a rare or even suspicious activity, the Vikings were the pretty boys of the North Sea. In the Old Norse language, the word for Saturday is logadaga, which literally translates to washing day. This wasn't just a quick rinse. It was a ritual. On Saturdays, the entire family would gather at the local hot springs, if they were in Iceland, or heat up large cauldrons of water in the Longhouse. They would scrub away the grime of a week spent working with livestock and iron. For a young woman, seeing a man who took the time to clean himself was a powerful signal. It showed he had the discipline to maintain his appearance and the resources to own fine clothes. If you were Bjorn, trying to catch the eye of the girl from the next farm, you would make sure your tunic was dyed with the most expensive colors you could afford. While the common folk wore undyed wool, browns, greys, and creams, those with status wore vibrant blues and deep reds. Blue dye, made from the woad plant, was particularly prized. Red, often imported or made from expensive madder root, was a symbol of wealth. If you walked into a gathering wearing a deep blue tunic with silk embroidery traded from the far-off markets of Byzantium, you weren't just a farmer. You were a catch. Then there was the hair. For both men and women, hair was a symbol of status and vitality. A man's beard was his pride. It wasn't the wild, tangled mess we see in television shows today. It was carefully trimmed and often braided. There are even records suggesting that some Norsemen bleached their hair and beards using a high-potash soap to achieve a striking platinum blonde look, which was the height of fashion at the time. Women, too, used their hair to signal their relationship status. Young, unmarried women usually wore their hair long and loose, sometimes with a simple headband or a small braid. Once a woman was married, she would often bind her hair up and cover it with a head covering or a hustrulu, signaling to the world that she was no longer on the market. But attraction wasn't just about the physical. It was about drengskaper, a concept of honor and bravery. A man who was well-groomed but lacked courage was seen as hollow. A man who was brave but lived like an animal was seen as a brute. To truly win a heart, you had to be a balanced Viking, clean, well-spoken, and ready to defend your home if the need arose. As the courtship progressed, slowly, under the watchful eyes of the community, gifts became the primary language of affection. But in the Viking world, a gift was never just a gift. It was a debt. The Norse believed that a gift always looks for a return. If Bjorn gave a girl a finely crafted brooch made of bronze, he wasn't just being nice. He was stating his intentions. If she accepted the gift, she was signaling her interest. If she wore it to the next community gathering, it was a public declaration that she was considering his suit. The jewelry of the Viking Age was stunningly intricate. We see tortoise brooches used to fasten the straps of a woman's dress, and clover brooches used at the neck. Many of these items were decorated with gripping beasts, a style of art featuring intertwined animals that represented the interconnectedness of life and fate. Giving a piece of jewelry was like giving a piece of your family's legacy. However, a man had to be careful. Giving a gift that was too expensive could be seen as an attempt to buy affection, which was looked down upon. The gift had to be appropriate for your social standing. It had to say, "I am a man of means, and I value you," without saying, "I am trying to overwhelm your family with silver." While the fathers handled the legal contracts and the silver, it was often the mothers who acted as the true matchmakers behind the scenes. In the Viking longhouse, the woman was the lady of the keys. She held the keys to the storage chests, she managed the food supplies, and she held a position of immense authority within the domestic sphere. A mother would watch the young men closely. She would notice who was lazy during the harvest and who was the first to volunteer for a difficult task. She would listen to the gossip at the washing pool. If a young man had a reputation for being hot-headed or unreliable, the mother would whisper in her daughter's ear, and the match would likely fall apart before the fathers ever sat down to talk. In this sense, dating was a 360-degree evaluation. You weren't just being judged by your partner, you were being judged by the entire structure of the household. It was a slow, quiet pressure that ensured that when a couple finally stood before the community to be wed, they weren't just two people in love, they were two people who had been vetted by the harshest critics in the North. As we move deeper into the evening, we find ourselves inside the longhouse during the height of winter. This is where most of the dating actually happened. Outside, the wind howls across the fjords, and the snow piles high against the turf walls. Inside, the only light comes from the glowing embers of the central hearth. The air smells of peat smoke, dried fish, and the faint scent of pine resin. In these conditions, privacy was non-existent. You were constantly surrounded by people, grandparents, cousins, and farmhands. So, if you were a young couple trying to get to know each other, you had to develop a secret language. You couldn't just go for a walk in -20-degree weather. You had to use the environment to your advantage. You might find yourself sitting on the long benches that lined the walls. Perhaps you were both assigned the task of carding wool or sharpening tools. This was the Viking date. You would sit side by side for hours, working in near silence, letting the rhythm of the labor create a bond. You would watch how the other person handled frustration. Did they get angry when the wool tangled? Did they work with a steady, patient hand? In a world where survival depended on hard work, these small observations were more romantic than any bouquet of flowers. The fire in the center of the room wasn't just for warmth, it was the heart of the home. Where you sat in relation to the fire determined your status. If a young man was invited to sit closer to the family's high seat, the Ondveji, it was a massive signal. It meant the father of the girl was beginning to see him as more than just a neighbor. It was a sign of growing trust. Sometimes, the dating process involved games. The Vikings loved board games, especially one called Onefatafel, often referred to as Viking chess. It's a game of strategy where one side tries to protect their king while the other side tries to capture him. Playing this with a potential partner was a classic move. It allowed for a bit of competitive banter and a chance to show off your intelligence. If a woman could outmaneuver a man on the game board, she earned his respect. In Norse culture, a wise woman was the most desirable kind of partner. They valued strong-mindedness over submissiveness every single time. While the man was expected to be the provider and the protector, the woman held the true power over the domestic dating scene. As I mentioned before, the woman carried the keys to the household. In the Viking Age, this was a literal and symbolic position of power. The keys hung from her dress on long chains, clinking as she walked. For a young man, seeing those keys was a reminder of what he was asking for. He wasn't just asking for a wife, he was asking for a manager, a partner, and a guardian of his legacy. If a woman felt a man was unworthy, she didn't just tell him no, she would make it clear through her actions within the house. She might serve him the smallest portion of meat or skip over him when pouring the ale. In a culture where hospitality was a sacred law, these slights were devastating. They were a clear, cold message: you are not welcome in my future. The monotony of the longhouse was broken by great seasonal festivals, like Jol in the winter or the midsummer celebrations. These were the prime opportunities for dating on a larger scale. People would travel from distant farms to gather at a chieftain's hall. These feasts lasted for days. There was music, the sound of bone flutes and lyres, and there was dancing. While we don't have many records of specific Viking dances, we know they loved communal singing. Imagine the atmosphere: the hall is packed, the smell of roasting meat is thick in the air, and everyone is dressed in their finest embroidered wool. This was the time for showing off. A young man might participate in wrestling matches or tests of strength to catch a woman's eye. A woman might wear her most intricate jewelry and display her skill in storytelling. It was a high-energy environment, a rare break from the grueling work of farm life, and many Viking romances began in the flickering shadows of a chieftain's feast. Interestingly, the Vikings had a concept that was somewhat similar to moving in together before the final wedding. Because marriage was such a massive legal commitment, there was often a long period of engagement. During this time, the couple was expected to interact and ensure they were compatible. However, the rules were still very strict. If a man spent too much time at a woman's house without a formal engagement, it was seen as a theft of her time and her family's honor. There was a delicate balance to maintain. You had to show interest without overstepping. You had to be present without being a nuisance. If, during this trial period, the woman decided she didn't like the man's character, she had the right to speak up. While the fathers made the contracts, the sagas are full of stories of strong-willed women who refused to marry men they didn't respect. A father who forced his daughter into a miserable marriage was often seen as a fool, because a disgruntled wife could, and often would, legally divorce him, taking her dowry and half the household wealth with her. As the feast winds down and the fire burns low, we realize that Viking dating was a journey of patience. It was about the long game. It was about building a foundation of respect, property, and shared goals. It wasn't a whirlwind romance of the heart, it was a slow-burning flame that was meant to last through the harshest winters and the longest voyages. In the quiet of the night, as the embers crackle and the household falls asleep, the young couple might finally share a whispered word or a meaningful glance. In that moment, despite all the laws, the sheep counts, and the silver prices, they were just two people trying to find a bit of warmth in a cold, vast world. As we move past the initial courtship and the subtle games played in the shadows of the longhouse, we reach the most critical stage of Viking dating, the formalization of the bond. In the modern world, we think of an engagement as a romantic promise. In the Viking Age, it was a high-stakes legal negotiation that required witnesses, oaths, and the exchange of significant wealth. To a Viking, love was a private emotion, but marriage was a public fact. It was the moment two families wove their fates together. If you were Bjorn, and you had finally won the approval of the girl and the cautious respect of her mother, you now had to face the betrothal. This wasn't a party, it was a courtroom drama held in a living room. Your family would gather their best speakers. You would meet at the bride's home, and the handshake would take place. In Norse culture, the handshake was as legally binding as a signed contract today. When the fathers shook hands over the agreed-upon price, the deal was struck. If you backed out after the handshake without a very good legal reason, you could be sued for breach of promise, and your reputation, your Orster, would be tarnished forever. There were three specific financial pillars that supported a Viking union, and understanding them helps us see how balanced their dating outcomes actually were. First, there was the munda. This was the bride price paid by the groom's family to the bride's father. But here is the interesting part, the father didn't just keep that money to buy more ale. In many cases, that money was held in trust for the wife. It was her insurance policy. If the husband turned out to be a disaster, or if he died in a raid, that money ensured she wouldn't be left a beggar. Second, there was the Heimanfylgja, or the dowry. This came from the bride's family. It often consisted of linens, fine clothing, jewelry, and sometimes livestock or land. This property stayed under the woman's control. If the marriage ended in divorce, which was surprisingly common and legal, she took every single sheep and every silver coin of her dowry back with her. Third, and perhaps most romantic in a Viking way, was the morgungjof, the morning gift. This was a gift given by the husband to his new wife on the very first morning after their wedding. This was hers to keep entirely. It was a gesture of appreciation and a way to establish her personal wealth within the new household. It could be a piece of land, a set of keys to a new storehouse, or a magnificent necklace. Once the contracts were settled, the dating phase officially ended with the bryllup, the wedding feast. The word literally means bride run. In ancient times, this may have involved a literal race between the two families, but by the height of the Viking Age, it was a massive, multi-day party. A Viking wedding had to last at least 3 days. If you didn't have enough ale to keep people drinking for 3 days, you weren't ready to get married. The primary goal of the feast was witnessing. For a marriage to be legal, at least 6 witnesses had to see the couple sitting together in the light of the fire. There was no white dress in the way we think of it today. The bride would wear her finest colorful wool, layers of silk if she was wealthy, and her hair would be elaborately braided. Often, she would wear a bridal crown, a family heirloom made of silver or even woven from flowers and straw, depending on the season. One of the most important rituals was the drinking of the bride ale. The couple would drink from the same horn, symbolizing their new unity. But even here, there was a test. If the groom couldn't hold his ale and made a fool of himself, it was considered a very bad omen for the strength of the household. In some Norse traditions, there was a beautiful ritual involving swords. The groom would present his bride with an ancestral sword from his family. This wasn't for her to fight with, though some women certainly did, but for her to keep safe for their future sons. In return, the bride would give the groom a new sword. This exchange symbolized that the woman was now the guardian of the family's honor and the man was the protector of the woman's life. It was a trade of trust. They were saying, "I trust you with my past, and I trust you with my future." While the Vikings were practical, they were also deeply spiritual. During the wedding, they would call upon the gods to bless the union. They didn't go to a church, they stayed in the hall or went to a sacred grove. The god most associated with marriage wasn't Odin or Thor, but Frigg, the goddess of the household and motherhood. They would also invoke Freya, the god of fertility, to ensure that the farm would be prosperous and the family would grow. Sometimes, a hammer, a symbol of Thor, was placed in the bride's lap to hallow her and ensure she would have strong children. It was a blend of the legal, the physical, and the divine. As the feast ended and the guests began to find places to sleep on the benches, the couple would be led to bed by the witnesses. Again, privacy was a foreign concept. The transition from dating to married life was a communal event. But as the torches were extinguished and the heavy wooden doors were barred against the night, the reality of their new life began. They were no longer two individuals playing a game of poetry and gifts. They were a unit. In the cold, dark world of the North, they had found the only thing that truly mattered, a partner to help keep the fire burning until the sun returned in the spring. The boring part of the history, the contracts, the sheep, the legal fines, was the very thing that made their love possible. It was the structure that kept them safe. And as they drifted off to sleep for the first time as a husband and wife, the sounds of the Norse winter continued outside, indifferent to their joy, but unable to touch the warmth they had built together. Now that the wedding feast has ended and the guests have returned to their own distant farms, we must look at the reality of dating from the woman's perspective. In many ancient cultures, a woman was treated as property, a silent participant in her own life. But the Viking world was different. To understand Viking romance, you have to understand that a Norse woman was often the most powerful person in the longhouse. If you were a young woman named Astrid, your dating life wasn't just about finding a husband, it was about finding a partner who respected your authority. In the Norse world, while the male warriors were departed for entire seasons, seeking fortune from the east to the west, the women remained as the absolute authorities. They oversaw the harvests, managed the labourers, guarded the estate, and held the keys to the wealth. This independence started long before the marriage. Because a Viking woman knew her value, she was often very selective. If a man approached her with a weak poem or a poor reputation, she didn't need her father to protect her. She had the social standing to dismiss him herself. In the sagas, we see women who are hard-minded. They didn't want a pretty boy, they wanted a man who could survive a winter and, more importantly, a man who wouldn't interfere with her management of the household. Perhaps the most fascinating part of Viking dating and marriage was how easily it could end. In a time when the rest of Europe considered marriage an unbreakable bond under the church, the Vikings had a very modern approach to divorce. If the spark died, or if the partnership wasn't working, you didn't just suffer in silence. You ended it. A woman could divorce her husband for several reasons. If he was lazy and couldn't provide for the family, she could leave him. If he was unfaithful, she could leave him. But most interestingly, if he was disrespectful to her family or if he struck her, she had the legal right to walk away. There is even a famous story in the sagas of a woman who divorced her husband simply because he wore a shirt that was cut too low at the neck, which was considered unmanly and brought shame to the family. The process of a Viking divorce was surprisingly simple. You didn't need a lawyer. You just needed witnesses. The woman would go to the main door of the longhouse, the threshold, and declare her divorce in front of witnesses. Then she would go to their bed and declare it again. That was it. The dating cycle would begin all over again. But here is the catch for the man: when a Viking woman divorced her husband, she took her dowry with her. If she brought 20 cows and a chest of silver into the marriage, she left with 20 cows and a chest of silver. This was a massive financial blow to the man. It meant that dating your own wife, continuing to respect her and treat her well, was a lifelong necessity if you wanted to keep your farm prosperous. Because life in the north was harsh and men often died young in accidents or conflict, there were many young widows in Viking society. In the world of Viking dating, a widow was the ultimate prize. Unlike a young girl who was still under her father's thumb, a widow was a free woman. She owned her land, she controlled her wealth, and she chose her own next husband. If a man wanted to marry a wealthy widow, he couldn't just talk to her father. He had to impress her. He had to prove he was a capable manager who could help her increase her holdings. This created a very interesting dating market. You would have young men trying to prove their worth to older, established women. It wasn't about youthful beauty, it was about competence. Could you fix the stone walls? Could you navigate a ship? Could you negotiate a fair price for wool in the market? These were the pick-up lines of the Viking Age. Despite all the talk of sheep and laws, did the Vikings actually feel love? If we look at the skaldic poetry and the sagas, the answer is a resounding yes. But their love was heavy. It wasn't sweet. They spoke of love as a longing that bites the heart. They wrote about the sorrow of the sea when a partner was away. There is a beautiful, quiet intimacy in the way they described their lives. They didn't have Valentine's cards, but they had memorous stones. A man might carve a rune stone in honor of his wife, not just because she was his partner, but because she was his good companion. The word companion appears often. In Old Norse, it implies someone who travels the same path. In a world where the path was often covered in ice and surrounded by shadows, having a companion wasn't a luxury, it was a miracle. Sometimes, dating involved a bit of secret communication. While the average Viking wasn't writing novels, many could carve basic runes. We have found small pieces of wood, called rune sticks, that served as the text messages of the 10th century. On one stick found in a Viking trading post, the runes simply say, "Jida says you should go home." On another, more romantic one, it says, "My love, kiss me." Imagine a young man carving these symbols into a small piece of birch wood and passing it to a girl while her father was busy arguing about the price of a horse. It's a reminder that no matter how many laws you pass, young people will always find a way to whisper to each other. Even in a society as rigid and boring as the Viking legal system, the human heart found a way to carve its own path. As the fire in our longhouse burns lower, and the shadows grow longer against the timber walls, we see that Viking romance was a blend of cold pragmatism and deep, unspoken loyalty. It was a world where a woman's yes carried the weight of the law, and a man's word was his only true currency. In our modern world, we can choose to be romantic at any time. We have artificial light, heated cars, and imported flowers in February. But for a Viking couple, dating was entirely dictated by the sun and the soil. Their romance had a seasonal pulse. There were times for closeness, and there were times for long, silent waiting. In the spring, the dating season often came to a sudden, sharp halt. This was the time of the departure. As the ice melted in the fjords and the longships were pushed into the grey water, the men left. For months, a young couple who had spent the entire winter whispering by the hearth would be separated by hundreds of miles of cold, unforgiving ocean. This is where the true strength of a Viking relationship was tested. While the man was away, the woman was the absolute commander of the estate. She wasn't just waiting, she was working. She was the one ensuring that when he returned, there would be a home to return to. In the Viking mind, distance didn't necessarily make the heart grow fonder, it made the heart grow tougher. Imagine a young woman standing on a cliffside in late July. The sun stays up nearly 24 hours a day, a golden, haunting light that never quite fades into darkness. She is looking out at the horizon, watching for the rectangular sail of a returning ship. During these months, dating was done through memory. The sagas tell us of women who composed songs for their absent partners, and men who carved names into the wooden railings of their ships. They didn't have letters or photographs. They had tokens. A man might carry a small whetstone given to him by his partner, or a woven belt that smelled of the peat smoke from his own home. When the ships finally appeared on the horizon, it wasn't a cinematic reunion with slow motion running. It was a moment of immense relief and practical checking. Was the ship sitting low in the water, heavy with silver and trade goods? Was the crew intact? The romance of the return was the knowledge that the family was now safe for another winter. The dating resumed not with a kiss, but with the unloading of the cargo and the sharing of stories from the East. One of the most attractive qualities in a Viking partner was the ability to tell a good story. In a world without books, your entertainment was the person sitting across from you. A man who returned from what we now call Istanbul with stories of golden domes and silk markets was a high-value partner. He brought the world back to the isolated farm. But the woman had stories, too. She had stories of how she outsmarted a greedy neighbor in a land dispute, or how she managed to save the livestock during a spring flood. In Viking culture, intellectual compatibility was vital. They valued a partner who was wise and full of knowledge. If you couldn't hold a conversation during the long, dark nights of autumn, the marriage would be a very lonely place. As autumn approached and the harvest was brought in, the social life of the North shifted back indoors. This was the season of guesting. Because travel was difficult, if someone visited your farm, they usually stayed for days or weeks. This created a very interesting dynamic for young people. A guest at your father's table might be a potential suitor from a distant district. This was the Viking version of broadening your horizons. You would observe how the guest treated the servants, how they ate, and how they spoke. Hospitality was a sacred duty, but it was also a screening process. If a young man came to visit and was arrogant or spilled his ale, he was immediately crossed off the list. The Vikings believed that the mind knows what is near the heart, and you could tell a person's heart by how they behaved in a stranger's house. As the weather turned cold again, the focus shifted back to the wool. In the Viking Age, making clothes was an incredibly labor-intensive process. From shearing the sheep to spinning the yarn and weaving the fabric on a warp-weighted loom, a single tunic could take weeks of work. Because of this, giving a piece of handmade clothing was one of the most intimate gifts a woman could give a man. If a woman spent her precious time weaving a cloak with a specific pattern for a man, it was a public declaration of her affection. It was her way of saying, "I want you to be warm. I want you to be protected." For a man, wearing that cloak was a badge of honor. It showed he was cared for. It showed he had a woman at home who was skilled and dedicated. In a society where your outfit was your resume, a well-made cloak was the ultimate romantic gesture. It was practical, it was beautiful, and it was a testament to hours of quiet, rhythmic labor. Now, as the first snow of the year begins to fall in our story, the circle of the year is almost complete. The young couple we've been following is now settled. The dating has transitioned into the steady, quiet rhythm of partnership. They sit together by the fire, the same fire where their fathers once negotiated the sheep and the silver. They don't need to speak much anymore. The secret language of the longhouse has become the comfortable silence of the home. The Viking world was a place of extremes, extreme cold, extreme violence, and extreme laws. But within that they built these small islands of stability. Their romance wasn't a firework that burned out in a second, it was a slow-burning peat fire that provided heat through the longest night of the year. As the wind picks up outside, rattling the wooden beams of the roof, the couple pulls their furs closer. They are safe. They are together. And in the morning, they will wake up and start the work of survival all over again, grateful for the companion they found in the shadows of the north. As the winter deepens and the world outside the longhouse turns into a silent, white void, we turn our attention to the objects that define Viking attraction. In a world without paper money, wealth was something you wore. It was heavy, it was shiny, and it told the story of your travels and your heart. To a Viking, dating often involved a very literal display of silver. If you were a young man returning from a voyage to the east, you didn't bring back flowers. You brought back dirhams, silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, and beads of carnelian and rock crystal. These weren't just currency, they were the diamonds of the Viking Age. Imagine a young woman, Astrid, standing in the firelight. On her chest, she wears two massive bronze brooches, shaped like tortoises. Between them hangs a string of vibrant glass beads, each one a different color, deep cobalt, sunny yellow, and marbled green. Each bead represents a gift, a moment of negotiation, or a sign of her family's status. When a man looked at a woman in the Viking Age, he wasn't just looking at her face, he was reading her jewelry like a biography. One of the most unique aspects of Viking romance was the use of hack silver. If a man wanted to show a woman he was serious about a future together, he might take a heavy silver arm ring, a solid band of precious metal, and chop a piece off with his knife. He would hand her that fragment of silver. This wasn't just a gift, it was a share in his future. It was a down payment on a life together. By accepting the silver, the woman was accepting a piece of his luck and his labor. She would often keep these fragments in a small leather pouch or have them melted down to create a custom piece of jewelry. This practice highlights the incredible pragmatism of the Norse. They didn't see money and love as opposites. They saw them as two sides of the same coin. You couldn't have a stable, loving home without the silver to buy grain during a famine. Therefore, giving silver was the ultimate act of protection and care. It was saying, I want you to be safe, even if I am not here. For the men, the competition was just as fierce. To be eligible, you had to look like a man of the world. This meant wearing a kaftan, a long, silk-trimmed coat inspired by the fashions of the steppes and the Byzantine Empire. In the Viking dating scene, silk was the ultimate status symbol. It was rare, it was incredibly expensive, and it had to be brought back from thousands of miles away. If a man walked into a winter feast with silk bands sewn onto his sleeves, he was sending a clear message, I have seen the world, I have survived its dangers, and I am a man of immense capability. But it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about the smell of the Viking man. While much of Europe was still using simple lye soap, the Vikings were trading for exotic spices and oils. They used combs made of reindeer antler to ensure not a single hair was out of place. They were the dandies of the north. For a Norseman, being well-groomed was a form of drengskaper, it showed you had control over yourself and your environment. A messy man was a man who couldn't be trusted to run a farm or steer a ship. We often think of Viking swords as tools of war, and they were. But in the context of romance, a sword was also a piece of jewelry. A man's sword hilt was often inlaid with silver wire or decorated with intricate animal-style carvings. When a man visited a woman's family, he would lean his sword against the wall of the longhouse. He wasn't just putting down a weapon, he was displaying his craftsmanship and his heritage. A beautifully decorated sword told the father of the bride that this was a man who valued quality, who respected tradition, and who had the means to protect his daughter. It's a strange thought for us today, that a killing tool could be a dating accessory, but in the Viking Age, your sword was your car, your watch, and your insurance policy all in one. It was an extension of your character. For the women, the most personal items were their beads. Archaeologists find thousands of these in Viking graves, and each one tells a story. Some were made in local workshops in places like Ribe or Hedeby, while others traveled all the way from the Mediterranean or the Middle East. When a young man gave a woman a rare bead, it was a deeply personal gesture. It was small, portable, and precious. She would add it to her necklace, and every time she moved, the slight clinking of the glass and silver would remind her of the man who gave it to her. In the dim light of the longhouse, as the people huddled together for warmth, these small, shimmering objects provided a touch of color and beauty in a world that was often gray and harsh. They were the boring details of daily life, the trinkets and the coins, that actually formed the backbone of human connection. As the winter begins to wane and the first hints of spring tension enter the air, the jewelry has done its work. The silver has been weighed, the silk has been admired, and the contracts have been solidified by the exchange of these precious items. The dating phase is drawing to a close. The couple has moved past the stage of showing off and into the stage of belonging. The jewelry they wear is no longer just to attract each other, it is a symbol of their shared household. They are now part of the same corporation, their silver merged into a single chest, their fates woven together like the intricate patterns on a tortoise brooch. The fire is now just a pile of glowing orange coals. The longhouse is silent, save for the occasional crackle of wood and the deep, steady breathing of the family. The silver and the gold are tucked away in locked chests, and the couple drifts into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready for the hard work of the coming spring. As we reach the final hours of our journey into the Viking night, the snow has stopped falling outside the turf walls. The world is perfectly still, wrapped in a thick, blue silence that only the far north truly knows. Inside the longhouse, the embers of the central fire are now just a faint, pulsing glow, casting long, tired shadows against the smoke-stained rafters. We have seen the negotiations, the laws of the kiss, the grooming rituals, and the exchange of silver. But what was the happily ever after for a Viking couple? What did dating turn into once the excitement of the wedding feast faded and the reality of the subarctic climate set in? The answer lies in a single, powerful word, félag. In Old Norse, this word means partnership or fellowship. It is the root of the modern English word fellow. To the Vikings, a successful romance wasn't a vertical hierarchy where one person ruled the other. It was a horizontal partnership. They were felagar, companions bound by a common property and a common goal. On the first morning of their married life, the dating process reached its final, legal conclusion with the morgungjof, the morning gift. As the grey light of dawn filtered through the smoke hole in the roof, the husband would formally announce his gift to his wife. This wasn't a surprise box of chocolates. It was often a significant piece of wealth, a field, a set of livestock, or a specific amount of silver. By giving this gift, the man was legally acknowledging the woman's status as the co-commander of the household. It was the final date in a long series of transactions, and it ensured that the woman had her own independent means. In a world where life was fragile, this boring financial detail was the ultimate expression of love. It was a promise of security. It said, "Even if the sea takes me, you will remain the mistress of this land." As the years passed, the romance of the Vikings shifted into a deep, unspoken resilience. We see this in the rune stones that dot the Scandinavian landscape. Many of these stones weren't raised for kings or warriors, but by husbands for wives, or wives for husbands. One stone in Sweden simply reads, Gulliv raised this stone in memory of his wife, Oddlaug. She was the best of companions. There is a profound weight in that simplicity. In a culture that valued strength and hardness, calling someone a good companion was the highest praise imaginable. It meant you had survived the winters together. It meant you had shared the workload of the loom and the plough. It meant that through all the legalities and the sheep counting of their youth, they had found a genuine, lasting connection. The end goal of Viking dating was, of course, the continuation of the bloodline. But even parenting was a shared, strategic effort. The children were raised in the secret language of the Longhouse, watching their parents navigate the complexities of Norse law and social honor. A young girl would watch her mother carry the keys and manage the silver, learning that her voice had power. A young boy would watch his father groom his beard and compose poetry, learning that a true man was more than just a warrior, he was a negotiator and a provider. The cycle of boring history would begin again, as these children grew and started their own slow, careful courtships under the watchful eyes of their community. The fire in our longhouse has finally gone out. The scent of pine and peat smoke lingers in the air, but the warmth is now held within the thick wool blankets and the heavy furs of the sleeping family. The Viking age is long gone, buried under layers of earth and centuries of change. But when we look closely at their dating lives, we see something familiar. Beneath the strange laws, the bride prices, and the silver arm rings, there were just people. People who wanted to be seen. People who wanted to be respected. People who were looking for a bit of warmth in a cold, vast world. Their history isn't just about raids and dragons. It's about the quiet moments by the hearth. It's about the boring details of a marriage contract. It's about the steady, rhythmic pulse of a society that understood that love is not a feeling that happens to you, but a structure that you build, piece by piece, through the long, dark winters. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of the good companions of the past. Think of the steady fire and the safety of the longhouse. The world outside may be cold, and the horizon may be far away, but for now, you are safe. You are warm. And you are part of a long, quiet story that has been told for 1,000 years. I'm Manuel, and this has been Stillnight History. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Viking night. If you've made it this far, I hope you found some peace in these ancient laws and quiet stories. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next chapter of our boring, beautiful history. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be as steady as the northern stars.